soft. It's sort of the consistency of soft butter, tofu, or maybe an egg white. It's just really fragile. And if the head gets struck from the front, you typically get damage to the prefrontal cortex that we talked about, and we'll talk more about. It can have contra coup damage to the cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain. It will also likely shake the whole brain inside the skull and will damage the temporal lobes, which we talked about just recently. And the temporal lobes can cause problems that are very serious. And so you really want to protect that brain. Things like heading a soccer ball, something as innocuous as heading a soccer ball, can cause brain damage over time. Soccer's a great sport. I think it's awesome, except for that one thing. I think that one thing should be outlawed from soccer. I don't think that anyone should play contact football, full contact football. The Amen Clinics has done a study on, I think it was 100 former and current NFL players who were suffering from memory problems, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, I think that's the right word for CTE, and dementia-like issues, Alzheimer's-like issues. They put them on a program of exercise, losing weight if they needed to, supplements that were targeted, and in most cases, hyperbaric oxygen treatment, which I'll talk about if you go through into that module. And it helped them recover dramatically. And these are people who have had the order of 30,000 concussions over the course of their lifetime. And it only takes one head hit to have a serious concussion. And really, medical community can't do anything about a concussion. Only this kind of protocol seems to help. And it helps even in the most severe of cases. So that comes later. I gave that to you for free. So let's talk about SPEC scans. I've been showing you SPEC scans all along. They are a window into how the brain works. They identify areas of the brain that are working well, working too hard, or not working hard enough. It's a medical imaging study that looks at blood flow and brain activity. The image on the left is a healthy brain. It's not normal because most of us have had traumatic brain injuries that we don't even remember or know about, and have had maybe asphyxia even from birth, toxic exposure from working in a confined space, building model airplanes with airplane glue will cause damage to the brain. There's so many things that can do it. The brain on the right is a heroin user's brain, and it looks like Swiss cheese. Those aren't holes. Those are areas where there's no blood flow and no brain activity, or very little. That's why it shows up like that. Which brain do you want? You can show this to someone who uses heroin, and they can change. It gives them, you can tell them that with abstinence, it gets better. And I can show you in the substance abuse section of this series, how over the course of a year, the dramatic difference it can make. between substance abuse and abstinence. So it gets better. I use SPECT images more for illustration than suggesting that you get one. Most people don't need one. In complex cases, it's the best investment you can make in your child's health, period. But again, most people don't need a scan. It's only in very complex cases. So here's a couple of SPECT scans. Let's see what a SPECT scanner looks like. And I'll talk about what it does. They don't fall from the sky, I promise. It's got 3 heads with gamma cameras, and they inject in through an IV into your blood system, your blood vessels, a chemical with a radioactive tracer that's picked up by the gamma ray cameras. You sit in that, you lay still in that thing, you don't go into it, just your head goes in, and it takes about 15 minutes to do the scan. And typically there are 2 scans done, one at rest and one in concentration. The one in concentration that they do for one more time. The test they do for concentration, they basically have you look at a string of letters, and every time the same letter comes up, you hit the space bar. And it is much more difficult than it sounds. It does get you to concentrate. And so they do those 2 scans. They do a whole lot of other things that I'll talk about later. But a SPECT scan can diagnose a lot of different things. It can diagnose resistant emotional, behavioral, or cognitive issues. I crossed out behavioral because most things aren't behavioral, they're brain issues. You may think that it's volitional, that it's being done on purpose, but most of the time, it's a brain issue. It can diagnose memory and dementia issues. It can see a stroke long before an MRI can. It can see traumatic brain injuries and concussions when an MRI shows no damage at all. You see behavioral problems as brain problems. And that all by itself can make a shift in how you react to your child. It's no longer they're being bad on purpose. There's a problem in their brain that can be addressed and fixed or made better. It can diagnose aggression, addictions. There are 6 types of addicts. Can diagnose overeaters, not from just looking at them and seeing they're fat, but understanding why they're overweight. There are 5 different types of overeaters. It can also diagnose autism spectrum disorders, ADD and ADHD, which I told you there are 7 different types. 7, not 5, whatever. Mood and anxiety disorders, of which there are 7, including major depression and bipolar. Schizophrenia, differentiated types and subtypes of disorders previously thought to be one disorder, and a whole lot more. I talked about the assessment that I do that's based on tens of thousands of scans. So it's kind of a cheap way to get a scan, gets kind of the information you would get from a scan. You just don't get pictures from them, you get dialogue with me on what is found based on your answers. And if it's done for your child, your husband and wife might do it, husband, wife, teacher. I can take many of them and put them together and come up with a composite view of the child. And you can do it yourself. It works that way too. Um, so what does a normal brain look like? Well, there's no such thing. We'll talk about a healthy brain instead. A healthy brain, again, we've looked at this before. There's the top-down view with the bottom being on the front. It's purple in color, but the color doesn't mean anything. It's just to show contour. And the left is the top-down, the right is bottom-up. In the bottom-up, in this case, the front is on the top of the brain, the back is on the bottom. Healthy brain again. This is a deep activity scan, and in the top-down view, at the top you see the white smile, and that is the cerebellum. It should be the hottest part of the brain. It is responsible for motor coordination and all kinds of things like that, thought coordination. So it should be the hottest, the thing that's working the hardest. And the rest of the brain, as you see, is cool. There's a couple of little white spots that are not significant. And then on the left side, we're looking at the bottom up. Again, the bottom is at the bottom of the screen, the top is at the top of the screen, and you see the smiley face that's red this time. Again, it should be hot, and it is. Hot meaning it's working hard. So, what can SPECT do? Well, it decreases stigma and increases compliance, for one thing, or two. Patients and families see problems as medical, not moral or volitional. It dramatically decreases shame, guilt, self-loathing, and anger. It increases forgiveness and compassion. It increases compliance. There is nothing else in psychiatry that is so powerful and immediate. Now, the two SPEC scans on the right, they show temporal lobe ADD on the top. It's a very severe case. The two holes, I'll call them holes even though they're not holes, but just areas that aren't working well in the concentration scan, are huge. And the temporal lobes are essentially just a mess, very small and disfigured with again, I'll call them holes even though they're not. And in the bottom view, you see that the holes are much smaller. The temporal lobes look great. Now, this is after medication. They gave Depakote first to treat the temporal lobes. You always want to treat the temporal lobes first. And then they gave Adderall, I believe, for the ADD, more ADD-like symptoms. And we'll talk about those kinds of things in that segment in the ADD module, if you will. But this gives you kind of a preview of what that's about. The idea is that you can use even these images to give your child, to show your child and give them brain imaging. Because you can look at those two brains and you can say, well, which one do you want? And after seeing what a healthy brain looks like, everybody wants a healthy brain. So they want their brain to look more like a healthy brain. So make sure that you get a chance to see the next video in the series of free material. It's going to talk about your child's brain